Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
You're not talking about defending your rights as Englishmen. You're talking about a new country. All the colonies united. A new nation.
My guest today is historian and author J.L. Bell. He maintains the Boston1775.net website, which is dedicated to history, analysis, and unabashed gossip about the start of the American Revolution in New England. His historical writings include General George Washington's home and headquarters, Cambridge, Massachusetts, a comprehensive study for the National Park Service. He also contributed to Todd Anderlich's Reporting the Revolutionary War and on James Martin's Children in Colonial America. In addition to that, he has written for several journals and magazines. Bell has been elected a Fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, a Fellow of the American Antiquarian Society, and a member of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. His most recent work is Road to Concord: How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, and that will be our topic of discussion today. Of The Road to Concord, Alfred F. Young, author of The Shoemaker and the Tea Party, says, "Here is the suspenseful story of how a handful of mechanics in 1774 smuggled Boston's brass cannon out of the town from under the noses of British troops." J.L. Bell is a historian detective par excellence who has recovered an important, little-known episode of the onset of the American Revolution. And we are very pleased to have the author, historian, and researcher of the Revolution with us today. Welcome, John.
Hi, Rob.
So, of course, the road to Concord, at least in the book, starts in 1774 in September. A lot of conflicts in the colonies prior to that. In the book, why did you focus in on that date specifically to start your road to Concord?
Well, my argument in the book is that September 1st and 2nd, 1774 was when the conflicts that indeed had been going on for years and years in Massachusetts, New England, America in general, they turned from being political dispute that could be worked out through political arguments and methods and economic boycotts and the occasional riot. That dispute turned toward the military. And both sides, General Thomas Gage, the new royal governor of Massachusetts, and the Patriot resistance against him, started to use military methods, using soldiers to collect gunpowder from a provincial storehouse, which the governor did on the 1st of September, and then a militia uprising of thousands of armed men marching east, which happened the next day from the Patriot resistance. And it's also important to recognize that that militia uprising didn't happen because somebody from the top of the Patriot movement sent a message down. It was a bottom-up response to quite exaggerated rumors people had heard about what the British military had done on the 1st of September. So on the 2nd of September, suddenly people were looking around. They were seeing thousands of men in Cambridge demanding the resignation of various royal officials. Governor Gage was in Boston across the river, worried about whether there would be an attack. People were worried about whether he would send soldiers out to attack them. And so everybody was starting to think in military terms. And we can even see that in the town records of the time. On that very afternoon of the 2nd of September, 1774, the selectmen of the town of Brookline, which was also close to Boston, they went and they started to talk about their military stores in town for the militia company. So right away, people were suddenly putting their attention to military preparation. Now, they still hoped there wouldn't be a war, but they knew as of that date that they had to prepare for a war.
JL, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today, we have Low-Flying Panic Attack American Pale Ale from Idle Hands Craft Ales of Malden, Massachusetts. Low-Flying Panic Attack is brewed with Syrian Dragon, Mosaic, Amarillo, and Cashmere hops, which brings forth an interesting blend of berry and light tropical notes with very minimal bitterness. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured brews. This is also my time to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Subscribing is the only way to get those newest talks right away. And to the legion of listeners and supporters from 75 countries and over 2,000 cities, I have to say thank you. And now I raise this American Pale Ale very high. And to the Patriots who gave General Gage a serious, low-flying panic attack in the spring of 1775, I say cheers. You know, if you go back to the French and Indian War and the cost of the war, there had been those taxes, the stamp tax, among other things, but those weren't really punitive. Those were revenue-driven. But the coercive acts, that's a different ballgame. Those seem punitive to me. The Boston Port Act and the Massachusetts Government Act, those are almost punishments for the Boston Tea Party.
Definitely the Boston Port Bill was a punishment for the Tea Party, or rather it was indeed to coerce the town of Boston into paying back the cost of the tea, which in today's dollars was millions of dollars. That was only going to last until Boston did that, which of course Boston refused to do. The Massachusetts Government Act was in some ways a punishment, but actually it was really a response, and it was supposed to be permanent. It was supposed to be a permanent change to the Massachusetts Constitution to make it more like most of the other colonies in North America by cutting down on the democratic nature of the upper house of the legislature and by cutting down also on town meetings, so that under the new law, every town could have only one meeting a year to elect officials unless they had special permission from the royal governor. And it was the Massachusetts Government Act, more than anything else, that caused the uprisings in the countryside in the late summer of 1774. The Boston Port Bill, well, distant rural towns, they could feel sorry for Boston. They could send food into Boston to help the newly unemployed there, but it wasn't really hitting them where they lived. But when the Massachusetts Government Act arrived in August, they could see rights being taken away from them by the royal government. Now, of course, from the royal government's point of view, the Massachusetts towns had already been too supportive of Boston and its unrest, had already been too resistant to the new taxes, and really the Massachusetts Government Act was sort of moving that colony closer to the other larger colonies to the south in how it was governed.
How did the colonists receive the fact that you now have a military commander as the royal governor, as opposed to, say, Governor Hutchinson had been prior to that, who had been in Boston and grown up in Boston, or at least lived among the Bostonians, but now you have a military commander?
That's an interesting question, because indeed, Massachusetts had not had a full-time British Army officer made governor, at least for decades, and I don't think ever. On the other hand, back in the 1740s, the governor of Massachusetts, William Shirley, was the commander-in-chief of the British Army in North America. So, in fact, Massachusetts was rather proud of what happened under Governor Shirley. That was when the colony took Fort Louisburg from the French. So, the fact that Governor Gage was also a general was not a complete affront to them. What really caused people to be upset was that when he arrived in Boston, he was arriving with more troops. And this was just like back in 1768, when the first set of regiments from the British Army were sent into Boston to patrol the town because it was thought to be too riotous. And that had led in about a year and a half to the Boston Massacre. So people were worried that with even more troops and with the Boston Port Bill, which meant that the Royal Navy was in the harbor, that there was going to be a military crackdown on Boston. No question about that. Governor Gage, being a general, was part of that, but he was also a known quantity. He had been the commander-in-chief in North America since the end of the French and Indian War. So he was not seen by himself a great affront. You're right that Thomas Hutchinson, his predecessor, was from Massachusetts, had been part of Massachusetts politics for decades, truly saw himself as a defender of the colony's privileges within the British Empire, but also felt that the colony needed to cooperate with the London government. And so in the end, he was seen by most of the people of the colony as betraying its interests and was more or less driven out in 1774. He was no longer effective. So that's why the London government felt they needed a new governor.
What's Thomas Gage like personally, and how is he as an administrator once he get into the position?
He actually was fairly moderate in his methods, and he was not known personally for having a temper. He had married an American woman from New Jersey. He had American-born men on his staff. And as I said, he had been the commander-in-chief in North America for over a decade, since the end of the French and Indian War, in which he had fought to expand the colonies in America. He had been wounded. And so in many ways, he was somebody who felt himself to be a good bridge between the North American colonies and the Royal Army establishment in London. Now, of course, he was British by birth, and he was very loyal to the British Army and the British Constitution. So he was not going to do anything which would, in his mind, undermine those things. He was there to carry out what he had promised to the Parliament and the King that he would do, which was to enforce the Boston Port Bill, and then when the Massachusetts Government Act arrived, to enforce that as well. They had given him specific instructions to move the capital or the legislative seat of Massachusetts out of Boston to Salem. He did that. So he tried very hard to carry out his orders. What happened in September 1774 is that when he was doing that, and he realized what a huge response it was getting, he had already realized that Salem was not going to be helpful and cooperative with him, so he had moved back to Boston. That was when he started to write to London to say, these people are militant, we need more troops, we need more money. The only way you are going to put this down is a great show of force, so be prepared for all that. And he even suggested that perhaps the new laws should be suspended for a while until they were the situation was better. All that simply cost him his credibility in London because nobody believed him. They thought he was being alarmist. And he was not the sort of person to be alarmist. But it became quite clear over the next few months, because that's how long it took for his messages to get to London and for their response to come back, it became quite clear to him that he was not going to get the help he needed, or he felt he needed. And so he was really going to be on his own trying to solve this crisis. He never, however, did things like try to arrest Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Dr. Joseph Warren, other individuals. He knew that that was not allowed under the British Constitution. He tried very hard to use the force of government as he understood it, but to stay within what he felt were British traditions and British law.
Eventually, he's going to order a group of British soldiers on that road to Concord. What's the composition of that force? What's the training and experience of that force, the British force? We'll get to the militia in a minute, but I'm wondering about the British force that's there with General Gage in Boston and in Massachusetts.
Well, the British Army is a professional army. It's all volunteer. It is men who have been well trained. We know that, for instance, the stereotype is that they didn't know how to shoot. In fact, we have evidence that they were shooting at targets, had many maneuvers. They knew how to fight in different terrain. One thing that the Army under General Gage did not have this, since it was 12, 13 years since the last war, most of those troops had not actually seen battle. They had trained a lot, they had patrolled, but they had not been in a war. The troops that he specifically chose to send to Lexington and Concord were what were called the flank companies or the elite companies of each regiment of 10 regiments. So they were the light infantrymen from one side and the grenadiers from the other. The light infantrymen were supposed to be more agile, quick. They tended to be flankers and scouts. The grenadiers were the bigger men in the army, also an elite corps. They tended to be more experienced. So that he was sending out his crack troops. There are some people who suggest that that was actually a mistake, because by sending two companies from many different regiments, that meant that there were men out there who did not know all their officers because they were not used to officers from other regiments. I don't know how much of a factor that really was, but it's quite clear that Gage was trying to send his very best, most reliable and most effective troops.
So let's juxtapose that force, which you just described, with the militia. The colonists had been protecting themselves. They're not professional military like the British, but they were used to protecting themselves for many, many decades prior to this engagement in 1775. So what's the militia like?
Well, the militia was a legal and social institution within the British Empire. There were militias in Britain itself. There were militias all over the American colonies and in other empires, other societies as well. The idea was that you couldn't, in that period, in the 18th century, wait for word of an attack to go all the way to the capital and the people there to respond and send troops, especially if you were in North America and the troops were far away in Britain or in another port, so that you had to have a self-defense force. The way the militia worked in Massachusetts was that every man between the ages of 16 and 60 was supposed to drill 4 times a year with firearms, with marching. There were exceptions. There were exceptions at the top of society. If you were a clergyman, if you were a Harvard graduate, if you were a past militia officer, if you were an elected official, if you were a miller, all those people were exempt from militia training. And at the bottom of society, they also attempted to exempt or bar black men and Native American men from participating in the militia drill. But what's interesting to see is that when the fighting came in April 1775, black men, men of Native descent, and top officials, even ministers, were marching. So although you didn't have to drill, when the emergency came, you were still expected, it looked like, to turn out in order to defend the community. Another important aspect of the militia is that it was organized by towns, so that you were in the company. If you were in a small town, there was one company, or even maybe you had to combine with a nearby town to make a company. And then that company was part of a regiment that was organized by county, and at the top of the pyramid was the governor, the royal governor. But that meant that when you were going off, marching off in your militia company, you were going off with your brothers and your neighbors and your cousins and your sister's husbands and the kid you see grew up down the road playing the drums, and the old man who does nothing but talk about what he did in the last war is suddenly very much more valuable now, and you're making him your sergeant. So it was a community expression of force. Another element of the militia that was a bit different in Massachusetts and New England than perhaps other places in the British Empire is that it was a democratic institution. Men of the company elected their officers, their lieutenants and captains and sergeants. Above the level of, say, colonel, it was really up to the royal governor whom he appointed. But that meant that if you impressed your neighbors, if you had a lot of, were popular in your town and people thought of you as a leader, they might make the sergeant and make you a lieutenant. And it was a way for an ordinary farmer or an ordinary craftsman to rise in society. So there are many aspects of the militia we don't really have any equivalent for these days. In some ways, the National Guard is the descendant of the militia, but because that's volunteer, because the way that the companies are organized, it's not quite the same. In terms of social structure and how it fits into the community, the nearest equivalent I've been able to think of is a volunteer fire company in a small town. That when there's an emergency, you know who's going to be signed up to go out with the training to fight that emergency. And there's a social aspect to the volunteer fire company and their get-togethers and their fundraisers and things. It sort of matches what militia drills were like 4 times a year.
Would you explain what the term Whig meant? Because there were Whigs in England as well, in the British government. And of course, that philosophy was the basic philosophy of many of the Patriots as well. So what was the term Whig at that time?
Oh, that's a good question. And I'm sure a lot of ink has been spilled in Britain about that. The terms Whig and Tory go back, as I understand it, to the late 1600s and the overthrow of the Stuart monarchy, especially James II, by William and Mary coming in from Holland, Mary being James's daughter. The supporters of the new government from the Glorious Revolution of 1688 were calling themselves Whigs. Whigs with an H. They called their opponents Tories, which was a slang term for highwaymen. So obviously it was not a complimentary term at that time. In the early 1700s, basically almost everybody in British politics was a Whig of some sort, because to be a Tory meant being very conservative, almost so conservative as to support the exiled Stuart monarchs, to be a Jacobite. And if you were supporting the Hanoverian kings, George I, II, III, then you were a Whig. But there were many types of Whigs. There were many factions within that, under that label. But throughout the British Empire at this time, to call yourself a Whig meant that you were supporting the idea of a more mixed constitution with less top-down authority from the king and more respect for Parliament and the local legislatures and for traditional British rights. Nobody called themselves Tory, but if you called your enemy Tory, that meant that you felt they were too authoritarian and were going to bend the British Constitution and give up certain citizens' rights in order to support the king. I use the terms Whig and Friends of the Royal Government in talking about the period from 1763-4 up to 1774. And then at that crucial moment when the politics turn into military preparation, I start to use the words patriot and loyalist instead, because there was a little shifting around at the margins at the time. So not everybody who was a Whig before that period remained or became a patriot. Some of them were just not willing to go so far as to break with the king and therefore remain loyalist.
Was the term patriot itself, if you would have went back to 1774, 1775, and that term was thrown about, would the colonists, would they know exactly what that meant?
They did know that the resistance movement was calling themselves patriots and Sons of Liberty and Whigs and other complementary terms. Interestingly, loyalist, which is also a term that became used by the end of the Revolutionary War, that means the same thing as patriot. It means to be loyal to the government. What they were arguing about is, what were you being loyal to? Were you being loyal to one vision of the British Constitution and feeling that the best way to preserve the best of that Constitution and the rights that British men deserved under it was finally to break with Britain entirely and set up a new republic that would respect those rights better? Or were you so loyal to the British Constitution as it said that you felt that break and republicanism was going too far, and that the king and Parliament, as being the sovereign legislature, was crucial to preserving the rights of Englishmen? I think both sides would have argued that they were being true to the virtues of their shared heritage, but they weren't really agreeing on all those virtues or the best way to preserve them.
Were there factions of those patriots who believed that the revolution in Massachusetts had already started? So the shot heard round the world and what we see in history books today, to them was just another step in the process, but the revolution had already started.
That's an interesting question. I don't think that in early April 1775, even the most radical of the Patriot resistance, say Samuel Adams, would have said that they've already completed a revolution. Because at that time, there was a provincial Congress elected by the people meeting out in the countryside, doing basically the government for the entire colony outside Boston. And yet it was still considered to be a temporary measure. There was still a concern about, obviously the governor, the royal governor, was still holding the largest town in the colony and the usual capital. So whatever was happening was not complete. Years later, John Adams is famous for saying that the revolution had already occurred in the minds and hearts of the people before the war. And really, he was speaking about Massachusetts and New England. He didn't know that much about the other colonies, and he didn't think they were as important. But there is an argument, and in fact, I think it's in some ways a good one, that there was significant progress in revolution before the war started. But I don't think anyone in early 1775 was thinking, okay, we have set up a new system. They were thinking, okay, this is an unstable situation. We don't know which way it's going to go, but we have to keep pushing.
Back to the military. The artillery becomes incredibly important
Yes.
in your book specifically. In fact, part of the title is How 4 Stolen Cannons Ignite the Revolutionary War. What type of cannon are actually there, and why is it so significant to the militia and to the British to have control of those cannons?
Well, cannon were weapons of war. No question about it. They're unlike muskets, which you could use for hunting and was obviously an individual weapon. Cannons were only used in war, whether on ship or on land. And so in September 1774, both sides began to grab hold of cannon to take control of those weapons. That was clearly a move towards war. Now, those weapons they're all basically metal tubes. And you put a cannonball or a chain or grape shot or some other type of missile inside them with a charge of gunpowder. You use a little fuse at the far end of the tube to set off the gunpowder, and it shot the ball out the big end. They could be made of iron and shooting cannonballs that were 24, 30 pounds heavy, or they could be small and shooting cannonballs that were 2 pounds, 3 pounds. Larger ones were better for siege warfare, for batteries built along the shore to protect harbors from attack by sea, and the smaller cannon were better for maneuvering around battlefields and also for training. So the 4 stolen cannon in the title of the book were what the Boston Militia Company of Artillery, which was called the Train of Artillery, what they used for training inside Boston several years before the war. And these were small. They were 3-pounders, 4-pounders, 2-pounders. They were made of brass, which meant they were shiny and new and impressive. Iron cannon were heavier, of course, darker, and more prone. If they burst, they would really shatter and send up a lot of shrapnel. So the bronze or brass cannon were safer. But when it came to the actual siege of Boston, those little cannon were not that big a deal. It was symbolically that they were something that the Boston Militia Train and the Massachusetts Patriots wanted to keep out of General Gage's hands as a way to demonstrate to themselves primarily that they were still keeping the means of self-defense in their own hands. And it's really surprising because one of the things I found in writing the book and put a lot of emphasis on is that there were dozens of cannon being moved around Massachusetts in the months before the beginning of the war. The Patriots were getting them out of other ports. They were getting them out of batteries. They were getting them off ships. There was some smuggling, but at this point, it looked like most of them were just coming from private hands or shore batteries, being moved from Salem, from Marblehead, from Plymouth, from Boston itself, out into the countryside and prepared for battlefield use. And that was a big and secret step towards becoming ready to fight a war. And General Gage began to get intelligence about that effort in the early part of 1775 and very quickly started to respond to that intelligence by sending out spies and trying to get those cannon back. And that's what eventually drew his troops to Concord.
When he makes that order on April 18th in 1775, did he view this as an escalation of force, or was this just another order and another movement against those threats that were out there? Obviously, it explodes into something much larger, but when he issues that order, did he understand that this was a real escalation of military activity against the colonists?
I think he did. He had sent out troops to Salem in February 1775 to capture cannon. They arrived too late. The guns had been moved across a river, and then the drawbridge pulled up, so they were not able to capture those cannon, and those guns were eventually moved out to Concord. But Salem and Marblehead, where the troops landed, those were port towns, so it was a relatively short distance, a short march from where they got off the ship to where they were supposed to search for the cannon. Going all the way out to Concord was 18 miles. And by the time General Gage made that order, he knew that the countryside was militant against him. He knew that the militias were training. He knew that there were towns along the way that had cannon in them. he knew that he was ordering this march into hostile territory. So I think it was a bigger, more forceful step than he had taken so far, and he knew that. Just before he gave those orders, he had received an order from his own boss, the Secretary of State for the Colonies in London, telling him he had to act. And that boss did not tell him you should, march nearly 20 miles out into the countryside to seize cannon, but in fact, the orders were to arrest people. But Gage knew that he could no longer keep waiting for the best time, that London needed to see him acting. So yes, I think that his order to march to Concord was a significant step.
What was his actual objective? If you look at it today, there's children's stories, there's mythologies, there's there's histories, there's legends about this actual situation that happened in April of 1775. Of course, you have Paul Revere's ride. That has to make it really difficult when you're researching it, when it's cloaked in such mythology. What's General Gage's actual objective?
Well, for a long time, American historians have been saying that General Gage was sending troops out there to do two things. One, to grab military supplies in Concord, and to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock in Lexington along the way. Well, there's nothing in the orders about arresting Samuel Adams and John Hancock. The troops did not move towards where they were. There's nothing in the intelligence files to indicate Gage knew where they were. So that is something which Americans have sort of projected onto General Gage's orders. However, it is quite clear that, yes, General Gage wanted to get out to Concord, wanted his troops to get out to Concord and to search in particular places that his spies had told him to search and find particular weapons and military supplies. And at the top of the list, when General Gage wrote out his list, were the 4 brass cannon that had been stolen from Boston the previous September. So that's clearly what he had in mind. And one of my arguments in The Road to Concord is that Gage wanted to do that, wanted to get those cannon back more than he wanted to arrest people, more than he wanted to do anything else that London had told him to do, because those cannon had been stolen out from under his nose the previous September, and he was embarrassed by that. And he had never told London what had happened, so he was trying to get them back before he had to tell, oh, by the way, they were in armories in Boston, and I had guards out in front of them, and they all disappeared, and I don't know how. So it was those cannon, some other cannon that he knew were out in Concord, gunpowder supplies. There were other non-weapon military supplies, food and tents and things like that, that were in the orders for the troops to find in Concord and destroy and then come back to Boston. That was what the order was all about. Now, it's significant that there's nothing in the orders and there's nothing in what people did about individual muskets or fowling pieces or other guns that individuals owned. They were not going out to confiscate people's own weapons. They were going out to confiscate these cannons, these weapons that had nothing but military purpose and were simply obviously there to resist or overthrow the government.
So when you listen to or you read some of the lore and the legend, when do you just roll your eyes? What are some of those myths and stories where you just have to roll your eyes?
Oh, there are so many. Well, there's an interesting one about a man named Samuel Whittemore. And the story goes that as the British were marching back east through his town, which was then called Menotomy, part of Cambridge, now it's called Arlington, it's a separate town, he, at the age of like 92, took his gun out and fired at the soldiers and was wounded 3 times, and he killed 3 soldiers and survived. And it's an exaggeration. What's interesting is it's not a total exaggeration because, he wasn't in his 90s, but he was in his 80s. And the earliest detailed accounts from his obituary say that he did kill a British soldier and he was wounded. And so even though there's a stone in Arlington now with the more exaggerated version of the legend, I would not want to meet Samuel Whittemore on a dark night.
That's great. That's a great story. So then if we can get through all of that legend and lore, what actually happens on that night? What's the size of the force that goes out? What do they encounter along the way before they get to Lexington? And then when they reach Lexington, what happens?
Okay, the first set of British Army personnel sent out are British Army officers on horseback with cloaks. And their job was to scout the roads and make sure that there were no alarm riders going out ahead of the troops. Because Gage knew from previous marches like the one in Salem, if the word that the soldiers were on their way got too far ahead of the soldiers themselves, then people would prepare and the objective would fail. So these British officers rode out on the morning and afternoon of April 18th. And what happened is that the sight of British officers on horseback riding the countryside was so on edge that caused the militia alarm, that caused the militia company in Lexington to get worried and to start to put a guard up around the house where Samuel Adams and John Hancock was staying, and to get the captain of the Lexington militia on edge. And then same thing out in Concord, where they were already moving the military supplies out of town and hiding them. So what was supposed to keep the alarm down, those mounted officers, in fact, I think caused the alarm hours before Paul Revere set out. The next set of troops sent out from Boston were about 700 to 800 of these grenadiers and light infantrymen. These were the crack troops. They were supposed to cross the Charles River quickly as possible, march as quickly as possible. It was an expedition, meaning it was supposed to be expedited fast, all the way out to Concord to search in these particular places where Gage's spies had told him the Massachusetts militia were hiding their supplies and their cannon. And they did that, but as they were going out, it was clear to the officers they were hearing alarm bells, they were hearing alarm cannon, they were seeing men on distant hilltops rushing along in the middle of the night. They were meeting men on the road carrying their guns. And they realized that they were not a secret expedition at all, that the alarm was already taking place. But they kept pushing to the west, out to Concord. On their way, they ran into a fork in the road at Lexington, where the road on to Concord passed by the Lexington town common. And on the town common and near a tavern nearby, the Lexington militia had massed because they were on edge, worried about Hancock and Adams in their town, and they had come out with their guns. At least half the company was standing on the green, on the town common, with their weapons in their ranks. So they were clearly a quasi-military force. Well, the British column was not just going to march by these people, exposing their flanks to an armed company. So the British officer at the front of the march and his troops, the first company, the 10th, went and confronted this militia company. Somebody fired a gun. Nobody's sure who. It was most likely a militiaman, probably not one of the ones on the common, but somebody off to the side. The British responded by firing at the company on the common, killing several. Then the British regrouped and marched on. Then they got to Concord. There was a much larger militia company there, but they were not ready to confront the British, so they turned around and marched away and massed on a hill on the west side of town. The British went through their search. During that search, they started to burn some of the military supplies they had discovered in the middle of town. The smoke from that fire was visible to the militiamen, the local militiamen who were massed outside of town on a hilltop and who had by this point been joined by some militia companies from other nearby towns. And the men on the hilltop looked down and said, "They're burning the town. This does not look good." So they started to march at the nearest British soldiers that they could see, who was 3 companies that were in charge of holding the North Bridge. And that was the second exchange of fire of the day, as the British shot at this much larger force marching down on them, and the militiamen shot back. And again, there were people killed. Within an hour after that exchange, which ended with the British retreating from the bridge, and then the Americans withdrawing from the bridge as well, leaving it open for another British set of troops to cross over it after searching a farm. At that point, the search was over for the commander of the British, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, in Concord. So he gathered his men and he started to move back east as his orders called for. And basically, as soon as Lieutenant Colonel Smith was out of the populated center of Concord, i.e. away from the people and the property that would be in danger, the local militia opened up on them. And that was the real start of the battle. Meanwhile, there's a third set of troops being sent out from Boston, which was the relief column under Colonel Percy, who was at that point General Gage's second in command. And he marched out by the land route from Boston up through Cambridge. It had gotten a late start, so his men did not get as far as they might have, but eventually he, coming from the east, met up with Lieutenant Colonel Smith's companies coming from the west, and they happened to meet in Lexington. And by that point, Lieutenant Colonel Smith's group really had been run ragged. They had been marching and searching for over nearly 24 hours at that point. They had been shot at. They were nearly out of ammunition. Colonel Percy had brought cannon with him, so he had a much stronger force, and he was able to take command, organize this troop, and get them back to the neighborhood of Boston, causing more casualties on the Massachusetts side and taking fewer. Still, it was pretty touch and go, and it was quite clear at the end of the day that the British had lost more men and had not really achieved their aim. And General Gage, at the end of the day, it was clear that he had started a war and he had not won.
So when those reports come in and General Gage gets that information, what's his next step? As you mentioned, he realizes, hey, this thing is ignited now.
Yes, and he had already, back in September 1774, he had already started to shore up the defenses of Boston. That was another clear indication that things were moving towards a military confrontation. He had put cannon at the gate of Boston, pointing out at the countryside, pointing out at the people he was supposed to be governor of. He had started to build up the fortification on the narrow neck of land that led into the town and asked the Royal Navy to protect the town with its warships. And so, to some extent, the town was already in a military posture. With the return of the troops, it was quite clear that it was basically besieged, that the next morning that there were up to 20,000 militiamen sort of washing up like the tide on all sides of Boston. Boston at the time was a peninsula, so they were not they were not directly at the border of Boston, but they were on the land all around it. And at that point, General Gage knew that he was besieged, and he had to figure out things like getting all the men in, so bringing some troops from other towns into Boston for their safety, sending word as quickly as possible to London so that they could start supplying him, because his main danger for those first months was going to be running out of food or firewood or other crucial resources because the town was under siege. Fortunately, because the Royal Navy had such command of the sea, that was really never in doubt. Fortunately for him, of course.
When does the British government, the king and the prime minister, find out about what happens? And then how long after that, because then Bunker Hill happens that summer, do they find out about that? It must seem like bad news just keeps arriving.
Yes. It ordinarily took about 6 weeks for a ship to cross the Atlantic. And that could be quite variable. If you were very lucky in the winds, it could be less. If you were very unlucky, it could take 3 months. General Gage sent his official dispatches, and this was one area where, because he was a moderate personality and because he knew that he had lost standing in London, he sort of understated how bad the situation was. But he was clear that a war had started. Naturally, he blamed the colonists for being the aggressors, for taking the first shots and for causing all the trouble. And he sent that on an official ship to London. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress, the rebel government out in the countryside, some of them had experience from back in 1770. After the Boston Massacre, the town of Boston had written up a report about how awful the situation was, what had happened, and then dithered about how to send that to London. And by the time it was in London, some accounts from the Crown side, from the royal government side, had already been published. So they had lost the propaganda battle. This time, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress was not going to let that happen. So within days, they had collected accounts from dozens of militiamen and other witnesses talking about what had happened in Lexington, talking about what happened in Concord, talking about atrocities that supposedly happened during the British withdrawal back to the Boston area. They had put those all in deposition form. This was legal testimony. They wrote up a report about what had happened, and they commissioned a sailing captain from Salem to travel to England in a boat sailing, as the word was, in ballast, which meant not stopping to load onto any cargo. The only cargo on this ship was the captain with these reports and the newspapers from Massachusetts to show that the reports were valid. And he got off as quickly as he could in England, made his way to London, got to the London press, which was more sympathetic to the American colonies than other parts of British society. And so the first that the British government learned about this was the American side. And the London government had to issue these reports saying, yes, we have heard this. Yes, we have heard this. And we are awaiting the official dispatches. Please remain calm. And only a few days later did General Gage's reports arrive, which more or less was the same thing. I mean, they corroborated the basic descriptions of what had happened from the Americans, except, of course, saying that the colonists had been at fault. But it was quite clear to London that this was already a problem. Now, London had already decided to send some more troops to General Gage and 3 more generals, William Howe, John Burgoyne, and Henry Clinton. And anyone who was practiced in understanding the British military and government bureaucracies could see that that was a vote of no confidence in General Gage to send more people of his level. And indeed, he sort of took a back seat after that, even though he remained the official royal governor for years later. To some extent, the British government might have thought, okay, yes, this is bad, but we've already taken steps to help. We're ahead of the game. And then, as you say, 2 months after the Battle of Lexington and Concord came the Battle of Bunker Hill with over 1,000 British casualties. It was in terms of numbers of killed and wounded, it was the worst battle for the British side in North America during the whole war. And at that point, they began to realize that we are in a much more serious situation. They also, of course, had learned from other colonies that people were being sympathetic to Massachusetts. There weren't fights in other colonies except places like Fort Ticonderoga, which is middle of nowhere at the time. But it was clear that the American populace was lining up behind the people of Massachusetts rather than saying, oh, these are rebels we don't want anything to do with. So it was obviously going to become a much wider conflict. And that's when they started to look at things like hiring troops from Germany. That's when the king and the government proclaimed all of the North American colonies involved in the Continental Congresses as in rebellion. And so they began to take more and more forceful steps. But it took a while for them to realize that the steps they had already taken, which they thought were forceful, were not forceful enough.
So my final question for you is back to those 4 prized cannon, those bronze cannon. What happened to those cannon?
That I would love to know the full story. And I think the last time I can trace them in 1775 is in May, when there was a British intelligence report that they were being moved to the front lines. And then they really fall out of sight because the American army did not do a very good job of taking or at least keeping record of their weapons.
Imagine that, yeah.
They were so important in the September 1774 to April 1775 period that they really, as I argue, they ignited the war. And yet once you got into a siege, they were literally dinky little things. They were much smaller than would be effective if you were trying to fight a fortified city. So they became much less important, and they drop out of sight, out of the records, until the middle of the 1780s, when Governor John Hancock of Massachusetts writes to Secretary of War Henry Knox, whom he knew as a young man back in Boston, and asked him to return those cannon, the 4 cannon, because they were really Massachusetts property. And to some extent, the whole war is about property rights and community property rights. And these belong to the state now, so can you send them back? And Henry Knox replied, well, 2 of them were captured. At some point during the war, 2 of them were taken by the British and have been taken away or melted down or something. But I have 2 others. And he sent them back to Massachusetts with an engraved message on them, labeling them the Hancock cannon and the Adams cannon, after the two patriots who were in Lexington in April 1775. Of course, one of them being Governor Hancock at that point, so he must have been pleased. And the engravings also claim that these two cannon and the other two that had gone missing were the entirety of the American artillery force at the start of the war. And that was a lie. The Americans had dozens of cannon in Massachusetts and elsewhere up and down the seaboard, and they were getting them ready for war. But it was the beginning of a presentation of the Americans as the underarmed underdogs, not preparing for war, not having collected cannon for the past several months, not having drilled and having a special crack force of Minutemen and things like that. No, we were just peaceful farmers out in the countryside, and the nasty redcoats came for no reason. Well, in fact, the cannon was the reason. Those two cannon, because they had these special engravings on them, after that, it is impossible to mix them up with any other cannon or to lose their history. They were like old veterans telling their story whenever they had the chance. And those cannon remained in the Massachusetts government's property for a number of years. They were put at the top of the Bunker Hill Monument in the 1840s, and they stayed there until probably like the 1970s, 1980s, when one of them sort of disappeared for a while, had to be taken down, went into storage, and then in about 2006, I came along and said, "Do you have a cannon?" And they had, and the National Park Service at that point had custody of this cannon, which I recognized from its description and was also able to connect, because it has weird dimensions, to the effort to collect cannon out in Concord. And at that point, the National Park Service put that cannon, the Hancock, on display out at Concord. So if you go to the Minuteman National Park and you go to the Concord Visitor Center over the North Bridge today, you can see the cannon that was what the British troops came looking for. And the other cannon is on display at the Bunker Hill Monument today.
That's awesome. And you know what this sounds like, John? This would be great if we dust off Nicolas Cage and we do another national treasure to get those other two cannon, connected to the founding fathers and everything. I think it's perfect.
That would be it. There is a locked room mystery. There is a real mystery of how the Patriots managed to get those two cannon out from an armory that was under British guard across the street from the British military camp in an armory where the only key was held by a loyalist. And that's what happened in the middle of September 1774, and that's the fulcrum of the road to Concord.
Well, thanks a lot, John. I love talking about the American Revolution. This was a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob.
I would like to thank my guest today, writer and researcher J.L. Bell. And if you would like to get his book, The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, simply click on the link in the description below. The featured brew was Low Flying Panic Attack American Pale Ale from Idle Hands Craft Ales of Malden, Massachusetts. If you liked our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. All of the directories have an easy-to-use sharing function. If you want more information on the authors and the books, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page, and you can check out our YouTube channel as well. The music was provided by the outstanding North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you want to listen to their brand new album, click on the link. It's in the description below also. And I'd like to remind you once again to subscribe to the podcast. And finally, to the listeners from across America and around the world, thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Who do you want to be? I mean, the answer actually isn't even important. It's the idea that we even have the right to ask the question, who do we want to be? We don't need a birthright. We don't need a family crest. And we certainly don't need the king's damn permission. What we need is a fair and equal chance. The freedom to live our lives the way that we see fit, and the confidence that that freedom cannot be taken away from us. That is our God-given right. And I, for one, am willing to fight for it.